Okay, so let's try to figure out the animation that we want to put on the background. Look at the original plate here. And it looks like they're waving, and then around 11:50, 11:65, they start getting scared. So we want to be able to see them starting to get scared. So let's say that by about 11:15, we've panned over to see them. We hear them. We're looking around and we hear, hey, hey, over here, over here. So we want to be looking at them by like 10:15 or something. So we'll start looking at some other part of the shot and then look over to them. So we got to get the cam main open and the sphere and the card, and we'll look through cam main. Make sure that we can edit cam main. And for now, let's pause update so it doesn't attempt to recalculate all of the pixels for every frame here. We don't really need that. So let's try to figure out our frame at around 11:15. We're looking at them. We'll kind of favor a composition that makes it look like their eye line is looking up towards something interesting, or framing for that. And then we'll set a keyframe there. And we can only animate rotation. And then we'll go someplace over here and look around. So now we're going to have to turn back on the pause. So let's take the card out of our group of things that we're looking at, and turn off pause. That seems pretty abrupt. Let's go to the curve editor, and I'm hitting F to frame everything. And we'll give ourselves a little bit more time to find our guys. And then we'll kind of slow out when we find them. And then after we find them, we'll add a couple more keyframes. Let's turn them back on again. Add a couple more keyframes just so it doesn't feel so dead. Okay, let's hide that card again. Okay, so now let's set up the final render and get this kicked off. Because we're going to want some motion blur on this, especially when it's moving fast, panning over. But because it's basically just a pan and tilt, we could use the vectors from the background to apply vector blur to everything. So let's go ahead and extract. Let's figure out our motion blur on our background. We'll just connect to the scanline render here that's just doing the background. We'll get to the part where it pans over fast. And for this scanline render, we're going to probably want to create a little bit of overscan. And then we'll just apply the vector blur up here for purposes of testing. Let's see how far it's moving in one frame, which is quite a lot. So we'll apply vector blur. And what I like to do to test the vector blur is to jump a couple frames and see if it feels like it's blurring the right amount. It seems as if it is blurring maybe a little less than it should, but the way I tend to do a test for what the ground truth of how much motion blur to get is I'll turn on multi-sample, and I'll make sure the shutter is at 0.5, and I'll just give this enough samples to actually see what I'm doing. So this will become my ground truth for sort of what I would visually match on my vector blur. So you can see the motion blur is quite extreme. I think my vector blur is giving me about half that much blur. So I would turn up the multiply here so that I get a comparable look to my 180-degree shutter. And in this case, as I mentioned, we want to blur everything after our composite. So I'm going to copy the motion vectors down using a copy node all the way from here all the way down here, just to be sure they composited correctly. Because even though technically this should composite the nodes, or it should composite all the channels together, well, it's actually not. It should pass through the B channels here. So let's just look at it. We'll see if the motion vectors are coming through all right. If they're passing through all right, we won't have to copy them down. So they are copying correctly through the B pipe here, which is good. So we can just drop this vector blur right in here, and it will vector blur everything for us. Including our little mini-me's when we can see them over here. Oh, but there's a little mistake. This should be after the edge blur, not before. So let's check to make sure that our vectors are okay here also. It looks like they're passing through the edge blur correctly as well, so we can drop down our vector blur here. And there we have it. Motion blurred guys. Now they still need little shadows and stuff, but you can do that on your own. You can either adjust the mats to where a little bit more of the shadow that was in the plate comes through, or fake little shadows for them. It's a fairly overcast lighting scenario. Really, they only need little contact shadows underneath their feet. They wouldn't be casting strong shadows here, even though they're lit by strong light. So let's get this wired up and render one out. I would say on a comp like this that's probably going to be kind of heavy to render, you might consider rendering it to frames and then compiling a movie when you're done.